So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from the holiday. So I hope you had a pretty good holiday break. Unfortunately, we'll have to go back to reality and proceed with our module 3, which is producing digital cleanup drawings. So reminders long before we begin. First of all, this synchronous learning session is being recorded. So if you have your mics on, please try to turn them off again. So if you have any questions, of course, you're free to turn on your mics. Second of all is that if you cannot see what I am screen sharing right now, we have our Module 3 PDF format as your reference. So if you would like to reference that one, that's quite all right. So for today, we'll be talking about producing digital cleanup drawings. So a lot of the topics right here, or a lot of the concepts right here, were already discussed either through the last lesson, which is your introduction to paperless animation, or last trimester, so producing traditional cleanup drawings. So a lot of the concepts are quite similar. However, the main difference right there is, of course, the platform. And when it comes to a new platform, there are quite a significant amount of changes. So we'll be tackling more into that one. The things that we have tackled beforehand during last trimester, that is something that I will be skimming through. So not much explanation when it comes to that one. So let's start off first with the materials and equipment. So for your materials and equipment, of course, you have your computer equipment. You can either use your desktop, laptop, or smartphone and tablet. We also have your drawing and animation peripherals. As stated beforehand, you have your drawing or graphics tablet. You have your mouse or stylus. If you don't have any of those, your finger is quite fine. Only if, like, let's say, or your trackpad is quite fine. So you can use whichever pointer tool you have. Next one is we have your animation software. So for the animation software, let me just clarify. The really important thing right here is that you need to have a pen tool. So if your animation software does not have a pen tool, I suggest that you would try and utilize a different type of animation or even illustration software. So with that one, I would like to recommend that you focus more on finding mobile applications with a pen tool, particularly that of illustration application. So IBIS Paint is a good one. You might want to find other alternatives. I'll also try to give suggestions by module 4. So here you that's the most important thing. The other things might be removed entirely. So like let's say if you're using an illustration software and you don't have a timeline, that's quite fine. But as long as you have your pen tool, yun talaga yung pinaka-importante natin doon. So you can use any animation or illustration software that you would like to use. But the one that I will be showcasing is Krita, and I'll be creating a lot of inferences from Adobe Photoshop. We also have our animation folder. So your animation folder is now digital because we're talking about paperless animation. And this digital file folder can be acquired either through flash drive or naka-LAN network siya or naka-CD and so on and so forth. So it still has naming conventions, like let's say the animation name, episode number or title, scene number, and character name if necessary. And it still has quite the similar number or the similar contents of the animation folder. There are some instances na pwede siyang maging physical, and I will try to point them out and point out the differences as well as we move along the way. So first one is yung sa may model sheets natin. So for your model sheets, this can be submitted to you or this can be sent to you digitally, but most of the time it would be sent to you physically. So it is recommended for model sheets to have them around your working station at all times, something that you can see and reference easily. We also have a storyboard. So yung storyboard, you might not be given to this one as an animator. Tendency is that it would only be shown to you before the start of the production process, particularly if you're creating an episode. O kaya naman just important parts like the scenes during, before, and after to kind of give you a little bit more context. We also have your layout sheets. So for your layout sheets, it's primarily digital, but there might be some physical copies like let's say your field guide o kaya naman more important layout sheets. Next one, we have your exposure sheet. So for the exposure sheet, this can either be physical or digital. Mostly it is physical because it is handwritten and then photocopied. para mas maganda in terms of referencing. It can also be digital by either a spreadsheet file o kaya naman a handwritten sheet na nakalagay dun yung details. If the animation studio has a lot more production assistants, tendency is that it can be transcribed digitally and integrated to the raw animation format of the rough keyframes. So if you're like using TV Paint o kaya naman Maya 3D or Maya 2D or something like that, they have an exposure sheet type of animation format. So for a lot of the animation software that we're using right now, we tend to have more of a frame animation. Frame animation meaning nakikita mo yung steps frame by frame. There are some instances that it can be a timeline. So that's kind of like similar to creating a video. Pero for the exposure sheet, this is more towards the actual animation software that we use in the industry. We also have animation scene files. So for this one, it's a more detailed version of the storyboard, which focuses on specific raw material, like let's say background images and rough drawings of the character that is timed. And then lastly, we have our key animation drawings. So for your key animation drawings, keyframe drawings and backgrounds, it still has the same content. So you have your rough keyframe drawing, frame label, time chart, special instructions, and production information. The only difference right now is that it is placed in a raw format. So if you're using Krita, it's a .kra file. If it's Photoshop, it's a .psd file, and so on and so forth. So that it would be easier for you to open and then add layers and then modify the layering if necessary. So next portion is we have the other materials and equipment. So for the other materials and equipment, we have either traditional drawing or animation materials and equipment. So for this one, it's not really something that we tend to use in the industry. You would tend to see this more in the pre-production stages. Pag production, it's very rare that you would see it. A lot of them tend to translate it entirely on the digital platform. But for us students, since we're not entirely experts or professionals in this type of field, we might need to have some handicap. So probably for some of us, personally sa akin, I would prefer to render traditionally rather than digitally. So probably what you can do if you have the means is for you to do the action or the main shapes and proportions of the action on the digital platform, print it, and then render it traditionally and then scan it again for the digital cleanup. So if you can do that, and that is much more effective for you to create a better output, might as well use it. Or if you would just like to utilize it for like, let's say, modeling, redrawing, rendering, especially for those who have phones and wala silang stylus, or kaya naman for those people who are using a laptop or a computer but they don't have a drawing tablet, yung redrawing process ninyo might be necessary when you are using, or it might be a bit necessary when you are using those types of materials. We also have mirror and camera, usually for referencing, mirror for the facial expressions, camera for the rotoscoping. Next one is we have creating digital lines. So for the digital lines, the first type right here is we have the types of digital lines according to the purpose. So when you're creating traditional animation, the standard that we have is just a consistent line. So pare-parehas in terms of the line thickness, pare-parehas in terms of the line darkness. And that is quite alright for traditional animation. I'm not entirely sure why, but it might be because of the material that's been used. So the porous texture of the pencil might kind of give you that idea that it looks a little bit more three-dimensional than it should be. For digital, however, since it looks so consistent, tendency is that it might look flat. So with that one, for paperless animation, we tend to utilize different types of digital lines to kind of create more dynamic to make it more visually interesting for the viewer, and so that it doesn't really look flat and boring. So the first one is outline. So the outline is a series of darker and thicker lines that are either surrounding the entire perimeter of the character. So it would help differentiate the character from the background, o kaya naman differentiating parts of the character. So like let's say yung head natin dito, It is enveloped with thicker lines, and it is divided with the body and the neck and so on and so forth. So with that one, we clearly know that this is the head. Next one is we have the detail. So the detail is basically everything else that's inside of it. So your hair details, your facial elements, your hand details, and so on and so forth. It's mainly used to detail the character. So ang main purpose nito is that the outline kind of brings you in, whereas the detail kind of adds, again, a lot more detail, a lot more visual interest. So with this one, you are able to create them using either thinner o kaya naman lighter lines. Lastly, we have shading or highlighting. So for shading and highlighting, these are lines used to indicate the shadows and highlights in a character. So just a quick recap of what shading and highlighting is. So when you're shading or highlighting in an illustration, tendency is that a number of us would blend it. So kind of like this one. It looks okay. It looks quite nice actually. But when you try to do this in animation, it's not practical. So when you're blending something every now and then, tendency is that the consistency might not be correct. So with that one, you would see a lot of jittering towards the texture, and it kind of breaks you in towards that immersion. If you're just going to use yung base shapes natin dito, so just creating a line and then dividing it entirely, it makes it easier in terms of production costs and time, and also it's much easier in terms of consistency. So itong mga lines na to, these are technically cleanup lines. So for these ones, they are usually done towards the cleanup stage, and then it kind of helps with the colorists themselves. So hindi na sila kailangang tumantsa when it comes to the highlighting and the shadowing. It's already indicated for them. Next one is that when it comes to a highlighting or a shadowing, tendency is that it has different color codings. So itong mga color codings na to, it depends from animation studio to animation studio. But some of the things that I have noticed is that yellow is usually used as shadow for the skin, cyan is usually used for the hair and clothing, and then red for highlighting the hair and the clothing. So it kind of looks like this. Shaded talaga yan. You have actually an error right here. So you have the yellow for the skin. This one is blue. So that's a mistake that I just like to point out para hindi lang kayo ma-confuse. So for this one, all of these ones, this line right here, that's going to be colored. Dapat walang lagpas actually, kind of like this one. Try to prevent something like that. And then color in everything with the shadowing or the highlighting, which is necessary. Next one, we have the styles of digital lines. It's quite the same as we had last trimester. So you have your standard, tapered or feathered, cornered, textured, and messy. So for traditional animation, ang pinaka-standard talaga natin is the standard one. So it's much easier or it helps you when it comes to consistency, yet at the same time, it still looks quite visually interesting. Whereas for paperless animation, you tend to see this more towards paperless animation because it kind of helps it make it look more interesting without really with still creating the lines that you need. So for your tapered or feathered, you would tend to have the edges of the lines a bit thinner and then the middle of the lines a bit thicker. So itong mga thickness and lightness niya, they have their own set of rules. It depends on the animation studio on how they would be able to create it. The thicknesses they have a certain set amount. Same as true with how thin it could be. So dapat wala pa ring opening lines, even though technically it is still quite thin. Then we have your cornered, textured, and then messy. So for the brush settings, this is something that's entirely new. So for your brush settings, this is something that you might want to change for you to be able to create different stages of the paperless animation. So we have a lot of factors that go into it. By the way pala, the one that I'll be showing to you is the one that we use for Krita. There might be different terminologies for the other softwares. It might also be something that is not visible towards your software. But that would depend again from animation software to animation software. I'll just be focusing on the important parts. First one is we have the type. So the type of brush is usually more of the style. So when it comes to traditional animation or traditional illustration in general, is that you need to be able to have these different types of materials to create different types of things. But if you're going to go digital, you only have one type of pen if you're using freehand drawing, and then you have different types of textures or different types of styles that you are able to create. So for this one, if you are opening your if you're opening yung sa may pen tool natin, so you can see right here on the left side, you have your different types of brushes. You can change it at the top part right here, just above the pictures right here. You can kind of change it. So meron tayo for different textures, meron din tayo for sketching, meron din tayo for painting, and so on and so forth. For us, in terms of paperless cleanup, ang ginagamit natin usually is just the digital one, the basic. So itong basic na to, it kind of helps with, again, adding a bit, making sure that it's consistent, not having a lot of drama actually. So you can just utilize something like this. For Photoshop, just have the basic round brush and you're essentially good to go. So it kind of looks like this. So it's quite normal when it comes to the creation of the lines. Next one is we have color. So size muna. For size, it usually determines how big or small the brush is. So the size of the brush is usually depending on the frame dimensions and resolution. So like let's say if you have a bigger size, then tendency is that you might want to create or you might want to use a higher brush size. But if you just have like 400 by 600, 1 pixel, 2 pixels is enough. Nextly, we have color. So yung sa may color natin, this is found at the upper left corner, just besides yung sa may pen natin. You tend to have two palettes right here, and if you change on the arrow right here, you can actually change easily. So right now, I have color red as my predominant color, and then black as my next predominant color. So it's just essentially switching. So if you're going to use it for redrawing and then cleanup process, it would be an easier thing for you to be able to use. So for this one, let's try to open. When you open yung color palette natin, at the very right side, you can see right here different preset colors. So ito mga preset colors that would depend again on if you're coloring, that might be a bit more important to you. But for us, ang importante sa atin is right here, the color wheel. So for the color wheel, you have two portions of it. So you have the circle one, which focuses on the hue, so the color itself. So is it blue? Is it green? Is it red? And so on and so forth. And then on the triangle right here, the one at the lower right side, that is the most saturated one. If you move towards the left side, lower part pa rin, it becomes lighter and lighter. So kind of like a color pink. Whereas if you move towards the upper part or the upper or the top of the triangle, it becomes darker and darker. So this is kind of like our sweet spot right here sa may pinaka-tuktok natin dito. So with that one, you can just use the very top, which is the entire black, just the black color itself. So the next portion is you have your RGB and then you have your color name. So these are other ways on how you can determine the color. So if you want to be more consistent towards the color, it's much better for you to memorize either or take note of the hexadecimal code rather than trying to color match it, right, or something. So the first one right here is the RGB. Red, green, and blue are the primary colors on how you are able to create a digital object. So in the real world, it's red, yellow, and blue. But for this one, it's red, green, and blue. These different numbers these different colors have values from 0 to 255. And for these ones, how intense it would be, or the higher the number, the more intense that basic color. And then the lower it is, the least intense it is. So right now, it is all at 0 because there's no color. If you were to go to the max of everything, that would be white. So like let's say if I want to create a reddish color. So itong red color na to, you can see right here that my color red is much higher compared to that of my green and blue. We also have the color name right here, which is the hexadecimal value. So it's a set of 6 numbers and letters from 0 to 9 and A to F. So just creating those different types of trying to move it around, nag-iiba din yung hexadecimal code niya. For black, it's just 6 zeros. Pag white, it's just all Fs. Kasi F is essentially the highest level, 0 is the lowest one. So for this one, you can either use black entirely. So you can kind of look. Personally, I don't really like to have a really dark color, and you would see this a lot in more paano ba? Visually aesthetically pleasing animations. They don't really use black as it is. In Japanese animations, you don't really see like the color black as it is. It's more of Western. So for this one, you might want to go a bit lower. So it's still color black technically, but you can still see that it's a bit lighter than color black. So it's a little bit less harsher, or it's less harsh. So for this one, you might not see the difference, but this one, the second line right here is a bit lighter. For some as well, they might want to create a darker brown color. So yung brown color na yun, try to make it as dark as possible, but it's still color brown. So one distinctive animation that I remember is that Grave of the Fireflies. If you're going to see yung movie na yun or that animated film, you would see that the cleanup lines are entirely in color brown so that it looks a bit softer. So kind of looks like those, kind of looks like those ones. Other cleanup lines can be of other colors. So for example, if you are creating, sabihin natin blonde hair, and you would like to really emphasize kung gaano ka blonde yung hair niya, you might want to utilize another color other than color black. O kaya naman for the skin, you might want to use a darker brown instead of an actual black color. So that is for the color of your brush. Next one is for texturing. Texturing focuses more on the visual feel of the brush. So this is really more for illustration, since for us, as long as we have the basic brush, it's quite alright. But if you are using it on top of your traditional drawing, it might be wiser for you to have a texture that is very similar to that of a pencil. We also have opacity. So opacity focuses more on how transparent the brush is. So let's try to have another layer right here. Okay, so I have this line right here at 100% opacity. And then pagbababaan ko siya dito, I can see. Yeah. Alright. So for this one, you can very much see that the color immediately has changed. So with that one, that's something that we'll have to take into consideration as well. Okay. So with this one, we have the first one, which is the color black-brown with 100% opacity. The second one right here, this is a black one with a lower opacity. This one is the same color as this, as you can see visually, but 100% opacity. So let's try to color them. Okay, yung sa may coloring natin, as you can see, I placed this layer just below the line. Pero pag itataas ko siya, so it's over it. But if we just have it right here, then pwede yan. So for your cleanup lines, it's usually at the very top, and then your coloring layers, they're at the bottom para hindi siya nakikita. So with this one, you can see the difference between opacity. So the first and the third one, they have 100% opacity. You can clearly see that the red color has gone past through them, but they are still not visible over the line. Whereas for the second line right here, it has gone past it, and you can see the difference between the non-colored portions and then the colored portions. So with that one, it might be, when you're doing cleanup, it's much more recommended for you to have a darker opacity. Next one is we have hardness. So hardness determines how visible the edges are. This is really more of Adobe Photoshop rather than Krita, kasi Krita tends to have 100% hardness anyway, and it's quite difficult for you to find, to kind of change the hardness. If you have a lower hardness like this, tendency is that what would happen is yung mga color natin which comes from the paint bucket tool, it will be visible. So parang may streak of light, or there's like a line that's color white in between the color itself and then the cleanup. So if it looks blurry right like this, it's not really recommended. It should be dark, it should be precise, it should be crisp. Next one is we have flow. So for flow, this is more of how the brush is being seen with one stroke. So if you have a higher flow, tendency is that if you draw over it on the same stroke, you would be able to see it, wala kang makikitang difference. But for lower flow, what would happen is that if you're not lifting the brush, it would kind of layer over itself. We have other factors in creating lines. So we have pressure sensitivity, we have jitter, we have stabilization. So stabilization and pressure sensitivity is precision in krita. For stabilization, by the way, if you are using a drawing tablet and you aim to redraw everything digitally, I would recommend that you do redrawing with a lower stabilization. Whereas for the cleanup, you would like to have a higher stabilization. So higher stabilization would allow you to create really good lines. So yung pagkaka-taper ng lines natin, as you can see right here, it looks quite nice. However, yung accuracy niya kind of dips down. So if you would like to have a better accuracy, try to have it without a stabilizer. Sa may cleanup natin with stabilizer. Next one is we have yung base. So the base is usually more of the pencil animation. So if you're going to place a cleanup on top of that one, that is more of another factor. We also have pen tilt and we also have scattering or spacing. Next portion, we have your do's and don'ts in cleanup lines. So we have a lot of similarities from the previous trimester, and we also have a lot of new ideas. So let's focus on first with the similarities. Number one is in terms of consistency. So for the consistency, dapat pare-parehas yung darkness, pare-parehas yung thickness. How thick it is and how thin it is, dapat may standard kayo. May rules and regulations that come up with that one. Next one, prevent overlapping lines. This will be medyo may asterisk dito, which will be explained a little bit later. No opening lines as much because the opening lines would result to bleeding out. Prevent any types of wriggly lines. If you can draw something a bit quicker, that is much better when you are compared to drawing a line slower, because you would result to these types of lines. Try to draw the lines with as little strokes as possible. So with this one, try to use longer strokes to have a lesser number of lines compared to, like, let's say, shorter strokes. Next, so the next portion right here is yung mga medyo bago. The first one is, of course, you need to check your settings first before you are going to create your cleanup lines. Next one is for the overlapping lines. For the overlapping lines, it is something that is better to be prevented. However, if you have done it, it's not the end of the world. If you have opening lines, that's more or less the end of the world kasi medyo mahirap siyang ayusin. You have to undo entirely. But for overlapping lines, tendency is that it is possible for you to erase it. But erasing it is quite tedious sometimes. So kailangan nyo talagang i-zoom in to the very pixel. Dapat consistent yung quality ng lines natin. If you just have a little bit of divot right here, that would kind of ruin yung quality ng line na gagawin natin. So it is possible for you to use an eraser for this one compared to that of traditional animation. Kasi for traditional animation, when you're going to erase something for cleanup, it's not really recommended because it leaves things. It leaves leftover mechanical pencil residue, pencil residue, meron din siyang dent, meron din siyang change in the texture. So with that one, it's not really consistent with the other lines. Next one is for you to be able to overshoot. So again, overshoot is essentially, sabihin natin, let's try to have another layer. Okay, so if you have one line right here, and then you're going to connect it. This is not really good. Undo. Okay, so this one is quite fine. So as you can see right here, merong excess na konti right around here. So this one is possible for you to be able to erase. Or if you have something that's open, or if it kind of misses the mark a little bit, it's much better for you to undo. So that's also the magic of using digital or paperless animation. It's easier for you to undo something. Next one is techniques for digital cleanup. So for our techniques, you have here freehand and we also have pen tool. So for freehand, this is something that we tend to use more for redrawing, and it requires for you to have a drawing tablet. So this is not something that I would recommend for us to use for cleanup right now. Not because it's bad. I actually think it's quite nice. I would actually prefer freehand. However, you don't really have, not everyone has drawing tablets. So kind of leveling out the playing field. So freehand usually results to either to something which we call as the raster graphics or raster format. So raster or bitmap utilizes a pixel. And itong pixel na to is good for compression. So when you're trying to create a smaller file size, it's okay for you to be able to use them. But if you're going to use editing processes again and again and again, tendency is that it might get compromised. So let's try to make this a bit smaller, this line right here, or this small shape right here. Okay, so if I were to make it a bit bigger, you can, I'm not so sure, but if you can kind of already see the difference in terms of the quality of the line. So slowly, it's becoming more and more pixelated. So if I were to, okay, sabihin natin if I were to save this one, okay. So you can kind of see a little bit of it. So pag nag-resize tayo, comparing it to the usual one, which is the one that's unedited, it should look like this. But right now, with just me resizing it a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, you can already see a lot of pixelations. And that is the disadvantage when you are using raster graphics. The next one, yung sa may pen tool natin, it utilizes something which we call as vector graphics. So vector graphics utilizes points and mathematical equations. So one thing that you'll be seeing for the pen tool is that it usually has these 2 points. So itong dalawang points na to would be connecting a line. And this line is usually the mathematical equation. It kind of treats yung drawing space natin as like a Cartesian plane with the placement of the dots right here, and these ones are mathematical equations. And since these are mathematical equations, if you would need to resize them or transpose them, tendency is that yung quality hindi siya mawawala. So that is your pen tool and your freehand tool. Again, everyone will be using the pen tool. You can use any type of pointer tool that you have. You can use your mouse, stylus, trackpad, your own finger if you need to. So for you to be able to create this, that's why I have chosen the pen tool compared to that of freehand. Next one is we have delivery platforms. So I think this will be the last part, which is a bit more taxing in terms of explaining it. So for the delivery platforms, we have different types of file formats. These are the things that would help you in terms of the production stages and what are the things that you need for you to be able to export it. So there are three. We have raw, we have video, and we have image. So raw is essentially your internal file formats. So these are the things wherein you have raw options. Essentially, you can edit the layers, you can edit the transparency and the opacity. If you have it in the final format, you can't necessarily do that. So it is bigger in terms of file size and it's not really final and you can't really showcase it anywhere, but it is good when you are just editing something. Usually your raw file formats are exclusive to the software, and usually yung mga software na yon or the internal file formats can only be opened to that software. So for example, yung Krita natin, which is .kra, you can't really open it in Photoshop. Pero there are some instances wherein certain types of animation software would have compatibility features for other types of raw formats. So for example, a lot of the different animation and illustration applications can open .tst files kasi it's one of the more popular ones. Next one we have for video. So video, this is the one that we use for moving images and audio. So this is something that you might be able to use for your module 10. So right now it's not really something that we would use, but our most common type of video format is MP4. Lastly, we have here image. So for image, this is the format that is used for moving images only without any sound. So if you don't have any sound effects, ang gagamitin natin is image. Also, image is used for a shorter animation. Video is used for longer animations. So for this one, ang pinaka-common example natin or the file format that you would use is GIF. I don't think we would need to use anything else rather than GIF. Next one for aspect ratio. So aspect ratio is, again, the ratio between the width and the height of the display or file. It doesn't necessarily think about the number of pixels precisely. So it can either be like, sabihin natin 1920 by 8 by 1080 o kaya naman 1280 by 720. It doesn't really matter as long as the ratio is quite similar. So the ratio is expressed in a column B, where A is the width and then B is the height. So the importance of aspect ratios is more in terms of consistency towards your delivery platforms. So for example, when you're doing it in your own laptop or in your own computer or in your own smartphone devices, it looks really nice. But if you have the wrong aspect ratio, if I were to view it or if your audience would like to view it, it might not have the same aspect ratio for the delivery platform. So with that one, it might stretch, it might squash. So nawawala yung appeal na proportions, or your proportions is essentially out the window. So with this one, your aspect ratios makes it so that what you view right now as the animator is the same thing that you would be viewing as the viewer itself. So with this one, the aspect ratios are usually dependent on the platform, whether it be film, TV, desktop, mobile, or web. So our main common aspect ratio, so we have quite a lot, but if I were to recommend anything, it's better for us to use either the 4:3 o kaya naman the 16:9. The 19:6 is essentially yung vertical version of the 16:9. So for this one, 4:3, it looks a bit more square-ish, so it's used for earlier cameras. 16:9, like the one that I'm using right now, this is 16:9. So with that one, yung width niya and yung height niya is compatible for most digital devices. So that can either be your desktop or your laptop and even your smartphone. You just have to turn it in a landscape format. So those are just some, it's quite important for you to know some of these things. For your activity, I'm not entirely strict when it comes to the aspect ratio. But if in case you were to create your own animation, it's much recommended for you to have something like this. Next one is for resolutions. So resolution naman, this is a more fine-tune of aspect ratio. Actually, they don't really have a lot of, they're not entirely related to each other. Usually what would happen right here is that resolutions take into consideration the number of pixels that are part of the aspect ratio. So how much pixels there are, that's the one that it usually matters. So for this one, it's usually expressed in either PPI, PDI, or P, or sometimes DPI. Sorry, DPI pala dapat yan. And ang purpose talaga nito is more of optimizing the viewing experience. So to kind of give you an example, sabihin natin you have a really good desktop setup. Like you have the latest processor and the latest graphics card and so on and so forth. So when you're creating your animation, pwede sa'yo yung 4K na resolution. But if you're going to upload it on YouTube or something, baka yung resolution na yun doesn't necessarily matter because a lot of your viewers will be viewing it either in 480p, 720p, the most would probably be 1080p, but not really 4K. So with that one, when you're creating these, or when you're creating a YouTube video, yung file size or yung time na ginamit mo for uploading a 4K YouTube video is quite useless because it's not going to be seen properly anyway. O kaya naman, like let's say you're creating this, you're creating a video that is meant to be seen in mobile or like in Instagram, and then you use like a 4K resolution, it's kind of useless. Even for Facebook sometimes. Like let's say yeah, you have this really good photo which is 4,000 pixels by like 3,000 pixels, but when you upload it to Facebook, bumababa yung quality. That is because it's not optimal to the resolution of Facebook, which really focuses more on minimizing the file size as much as possible. So with that one, there are usually two types of resolution. So we have video resolution and image resolution. The one that I'll be focusing more is image resolution. So for your image resolution, it doesn't really have a lot of difference actually aside from the file size. And the second one is you will not really see the difference if you are not printing it. So if you're printing it, what would happen is that the 72 ppi for the web format is lower in terms of quality but bigger in size. And then the video format, it might be smaller, but it is better in terms of overall quality. So, however, right now, since we're not really printing anything, you can use either or. It just really depends on your internet connectivity. So if your web format is, or if you're the type of person who has limited internet connection or slow internet connection, it would be better for you to have a 72 ppi na animation. The reason being, black and white naman siya. It doesn't really have a lot of color in it. And with that one, it's okay for you to just have a 72 ppi and it's lesser in terms of file size. Video format na 300 ppi is it makes it slightly better, but to the untrained eye, there's not really a lot of difference towards it. So with that one, if you can, just use the 72 ppi. If you would like to use the 300 ppi, it's also okay. So the last portions, ito kasi they're quite something na it's much better for us to discuss them when you are already doing the cleanup itself. So I'll just be doing a small rundown to it. First one is preparation of materials and equipment. So that's something na you have to look into before you actually create it. We also have the receiving and checking of animation folder. So it can either come in a digital and printed printed format. Always check the contents, report if necessary, so that if ever made mistakes, it's not accountable to you. Next one, the checking of rough key drawings and breakdowns. So for this one, how you're going to check it is quite similar to that one of a traditional rough keyframe drawing. Analyzing it is also essentially the same thing, but the only thing right here is that you need to add a new layer. So itong bagong layer na to would kind of serve as a safety net. So if ever nagkaroon ka ng accidental drawing over the rough key drawing, then at least that is eliminated. Next one is we have the redrawing process. So again, the redrawing process is more of adding a new layer and then working on the things that you have seen towards the analysis of the rough key drawings. And then we also have the actual cleanup proper. So in demonstration nito, it would be much better for us to see for module 4. And then lastly, exporting. So when you're going to export, it is important for you to save the two file formats. Either the raw file format, so your .kra, .psd, and so on and so forth. And then also have the GIF version, which is the one that you will be submitting. For your submission, this is more for the industry, but for us, you will be using your Canvas K-12 LMS. And then lastly, for your revision and editing. So revision and editing, this is an optional step. If you have done your work correctly, then you don't need to do this. But if you have done, if there is a need for a revision call, then that is where it comes into play. For editing and revising cleanup key drawings, it's essentially the same as traditional animation. So you have your different personnel, you have your different revision calls, which is quite the same thing. Meron lang na, like let's say, there are just some things that were added in that were removed, but it's just like 1 or 2 items. And then we also have some interventions. So these are just some things that you would need to do if in case you are having a revision call. If this were face-to-face, probably we would be able to practice revision call. But for now, since we're going online or module based for this one, unfortunately we can't really do revisions. So that ends my presentation for today. May questions po ba tayo?